As guardians of future generations, we aren't taking our jobs seriously. Thus, the Water Conference H2O #2. Carl Sagan said, anything else you're interested in is not going to happen if you can't breathe the air and if you can't drink the water. Don't sit this one out, he says. Do something. You are, by accident of fate, alive at an absolutely critical moment in the history of our planet. Today we'll learn the real facts of our water situation, not just what you saw in the very glossy video that you what our experts that we have asked to come have to say is backed by research, and that's very, very important. As the late great Mark Reisner said, however, in his landmark book, Cadillac Desert, in the West, of course, where water is concerned, logic and reason have never figured predominantly in the scheme of things. As long as we maintain a civilization in a semi-desert with a desert heart, the yearning to civilize more of it will always be there. We have to change that yearning and think about the planet of which we are the guardians, keeping it livable for future generations. At the end of the day, each of us will be asked to do an activist pledge, something we can write down and remember to do about the work that we have learned to do today. It will be photographed so we can put it up on YouTube, and you can go to YouTube, look at it and say, yeah, I promised to do that. Maybe I better continue. I've forgotten. Now, I would like to introduce our wonderful, wonderful Master of Ceremonies, Jack Nolden, who is an experienced news anchor for Channel 24, and he will steer our ship throughout the morning's troubled waters, introducing our speakers and facilitating the Q&A at the end of each panel. Let's welcome Jack.
Thank you all very much, and I'd like to kind of expand upon the remarks I made earlier about what the Winneman Wintu chief was talking about outside. And I'd like to introduce what I think is the way we all ought to be looking at the planet that we live in. You see, it's not as if it was given to us for us to be guardians of. We are not guardians of this planet. This planet is our only life support system. It is the only known life support system that we have. So when you think about it that way, you know that if you foul up your own nest, you foul up your life support system. And when you foul up your life support system, you foul up yourself. In other words, this is something that we all had better start paying attention to, because we now know that we have breached the 400 parts per million level of CO2 gases in the atmosphere. And some people think that that puts us on an irreversible path toward real, significant, unalterable change that will threaten all life on this planet. So we have built a very sophisticated system here in California, and as you can see from the videos that you looked at there, there's only one outlet to the sea, and that's the San Francisco Bay. The Delta then becomes like our incubator for all life here. You know, you think that the Kern and the Kaweah and all of those rivers south of the San Joaquin Delta, everything that's south of the Delta, okay, they really don't have an outlet to the sea. That's the reason why this area was such a huge swamp, and why Tulare Lake was the largest freshwater lake west of the Mississippi. at one time, which really no longer exists, okay? So those rivers didn't have a way out. We have changed that dynamic because now there's a way to get that water out through the San Joaquin River and down the channel. But what we have done, quite literally, is use up all the water. Now that the snow is iffy, that is really a really serious problem because our entire civilization, as we know it, no matter where you live on this planet, is predicated upon there being abundant snow in some nearby mountain. Last year, we got a little. This year, hardly any. And that is the situation that we face. So, I welcome you to the Central Valley Water Consortium's Water Conference 2014. You all know who I am. I worked at Channel 24 News. But you also know that we are experiencing a severe drought. And that is going to tax everything that we know of this summer. We don't actually know whether we're going to have enough water for some of the cities. We don't know whether we're going to have enough water to grow the crops that we've been accustomed to, especially things like almonds, the nut trees and things like that that use a lot of water. Will we lose them? We don't know. So what do we have to do? We have to educate ourselves about the situation so that we can better understand how to move forward. And this summer, there's one thing that we know for sure. There's not enough surface water. So there's going to be massive pumping of groundwater from underneath our feet. We know that for a fact. And that brings me to our keynote speaker, Dr. Jeffrey Michael. He's Director of Business Forecasting for the University of the Pacific in Stockton. Dr. Michael is here to give us an overview of how he sees the drought affecting life, business, and everything else in our state. Please welcome Dr. Jeffrey Michael.
I got into this topic 5 or 6 years ago during the last drought in 2009, in large part sort of debunking some of the hysterical claims about drought impacts on our economy. They're serious, but when I watch videos produced by the state that put people from Silicon Valley up there suggesting that the tech industry is at risk from the Delta Smelt or the Endangered Species Act. In fact, I think the tech industry is attracted to this state by its history and commitment to environmental protection, and faces no threat whatsoever from the smelt. I shouldn't say the tech industry is mainly attracted to that, but I'll say that the highly educated workforce they depend upon cares about that. $2 trillion economies, videos that show nice things about Delta communities, then talk about an earthquake and a flood, and that the only impact of that would be to cut water supplies for weeks or months or years. And that's the thing that actually upsets me the most, is when they beat the drumbeat about an earthquake that would flood 30 islands in the Delta and completely ignore the devastating impacts that would have on those Delta communities. Now, people in the Delta don't necessarily believe that that's a likely scenario. I'll leave that for the scientists. But I know that as a state, if we actually think that that's a severe risk for us and we're going to invoke tragedies like Katrina, that we, as a call to action, then that call to action should be for flood control, protecting lives, and saving communities in that area first. And we can, if we put our focus on that, then we will also protect the ability of the Delta to serve as water transport infrastructure for farms in this region. So it upsets me a little bit whenever I see this sort of discussion of the flood and the earthquake and that $2 trillion economies are at risk. Now, there are important risks the drought does have economic impacts. We just need to make sure that we put them in perspective, and if we don't have them in perspective, we run the risk of making some mistakes as a society. So someone's going to flash time at me today so that I don't go on for too long, but I was going to talk about economic impact aspects of the drought and also the Delta Tunnel proposal, and particularly what it means for Central Valley agriculture, both in the Delta and in the San Joaquin Valley. So let's get into it here. First of all, there's a lot of talk about jobs. We saw some of that on the video earlier. And I've gotten a lot of calls this year asking about what are the labor market impacts of the drought. So I'm going to talk about that a little bit. And any predictions that I make, please bear in mind that these are sort of highly preliminary, better than speculative, but certainly it's sort of informed guesses at this point, and we won't really know all the impacts until after the fact. But before you look at a labor market, one of the things and some of the impacts of it, what are the recent trends in the labor market? So what do we see in the Valley economy? And forgive me if I'm going to not talk about water for a little bit, but talk about numbers and boring things that economists talk about. But to me, when I look at Central Valley agriculture, I think the piece of data that isn't discussed enough is wages. And as an economist, when this is really important. What is the income that's supported by industry? What are the wage rates? What are the trends in the labor market? Now, historically in the San Joaquin Valley, the average wage to farm labor has run between $2 and $3 above the minimum wage. There's a lot of workers working at the minimum wage, some higher skilled workers above that, but the average has been about $2 to $3 above the minimum. In recent years, from 2008 to 2011, there was some increases in wages that were very much pushed by increases in the minimum wage, and that occurred just prior to 2008. And then the average wage sort of settled in at about $11 an hour flat for 4 years. And this is based on tax return data collected by the state of California. In recent years, there's been a positive movement in that, actually. So in 2012, the average wage in the San Joaquin Valley increased to $11.82. It's a pretty good increase for a year. 2013, we're waiting for the data from the last months, but for what is in to date, that for the first 10 months of 2013, we saw another dollar increase to $12.93. So the market has increased to nearly $5 above the minimum wage on average, which is a record, and that's positive. In July, there'll be another increase in the minimum wage to $9 an hour, and about 18 months later, there'll be another change. So the labor market for farm labor we've seen is characterized recently by rising wages, which is some evidence that maybe some of the discussion about labor market shortages, which have been talked about for a long time in the Valley, and some economists have sort of scoffed at that when the wages aren't rising. We've seen some movement in wages. It isn't driven by policy, and it suggests that the shortages maybe are actually more for real. What about the number of jobs? Well, jobs are higher during the harvesting season, the summer, lower during the winter. Over the course of a year, agricultural jobs in the San Joaquin Valley over the past decade have ranged from 174,000 to 197,000. So that's a lot of jobs. The lowest in the past decade was actually in 2004. Interestingly, not 2009 during the drought, although 2009 we did see a decline in jobs. And the highest, and this is what's interesting to me, the highest number of agricultural jobs that we've seen really in over a decade in the San Joaquin Valley has been the last 2 years. 2012 and 2013 have seen 197,000 agricultural jobs in the valley. That's almost half of all the agricultural jobs in California. And by valley, I'm referring to the 8 counties that are typically referred to as the San Joaquin Valley, from San Joaquin County and Stockton, sort of in the north down to Kern and Bakersfield. So this is sort of interesting as economists. So if we say, what are the labor market impacts going to be in 2014? We say, what are the recent trends? We actually have rising wages and rising employment. And I was a little surprised by that, even the rising employment trend, because I hear about how there aren't enough workers. So you would expect lower employment when there aren't enough workers. Actually, that's the story of 2004. Part of the reason there's fewer jobs is the alternative employment opportunities. And also you hear about water shortages, you hear about crop conversions to nuts from vegetables, which are less labor intensive, and it sort of becomes a bit of a mystery. Because when you see wages rising and you see jobs rising, you know, the Econ 101 explanation of that is that you have an industry that's expanding. It doesn't matter whether it's agriculture or anything, you see an industry that's expanding. And so that led me to go, I hadn't looked at this data in a while, but I went back and pulled the county crop reports. It says, well, what has happened to acres harvested in the valley? And 2012, we don't have final numbers on 2013 yet, but I compared 2007 and 2012. These were sort of the very first years of these 3-year drought episodes, but in the very first years, very little impact on agriculture. It's as the drought goes forward. So these are pretty good comparative data points. And we gathered this for the 8 counties and looked at the major categories of crops, field crops, corn and alfalfa, primarily used for animal feed, through to nut crops that are really, you know, the real high cash crops in the valley, and vegetable crops. And if we compare 2007 to 2012, what I found really interesting is a nearly 400,000 acre increase in acres harvested in the San Joaquin Valley over this 5-year period. And so here was this explanation of this conundrum where I was a little surprised to see agricultural jobs growing. But here's a logical explanation. That's a 7% increase in harvested acres. But it occurs in the face of what I keep hearing about are water and labor challenges that are sort of threatening the industry, yet is expanded. And I have really mixed feelings about it as an economist. Sort of on one level, we've been coming through a horrible recession during this period, and so the industry growth, I'm excited. If industry growth is helping drive wage growth for farm workers, then that's good. If it's helping us recover from the economy, you know, I'm happy about that. But serious questions about the sustainability of this. Most of the growth has been in permanent crops. A lot of it has been planted on land that doesn't have good water supplies. We've added over 1 million acre feet of permanent demand to the groundwater resource in the region. And so there's concern about whether it's sustainable and whether to expand the industry in this way, or, you know, are we just setting ourselves up for an even larger collapse in the future? So there's certainly some concerns about it, but it explains where we're at heading into this drought. In 2009, drought was not as severe as this year. A number of assessments were done on that, including my own. Proud to say that the final assessments were closest to our initial assessment, so we have some credibility on this topic from the last one, that we were criticized for sort of low impacts originally, but at the end of the day they came in pretty close to what we said. Now the impacts in 2009, more or less, from more than just my own assessment, are about at this level. 250,000 acres, fewer acres in production in 2009. $350 million in crop revenue. 90% of the fallowing basically was field crops, which are lower value, and that's a rational response to water shortages, is to fallow those field crops. It puts pressure on your animal producers and your dairies who have to import more feed and within the region, but that's a rational response to a water shortage. Loss of 5,000 to 9,000 jobs certainly was bad, but especially coming in the midst of a horrible recession. By our estimates, there's over 70,000 jobs directly related to the home building industry collapse that occurred at the same time, and well over 100,000 jobs lost in the San Joaquin Valley total in 2009. And another impact of it is all the negative impacts were concentrated in 3 counties, here in Fresno, Kings, and Kern. This year's drought, now again, extremely preliminary estimate. There's not really good information, and it's really based on, I've heard estimates of 500 to 800,000 fewer acres this year will be in production. But again, we don't really have any good numbers on that. We won't be able to know that till the end of the year. But assuming that that's correct, and it seems like a reasonable number to me when you look at the severity of the drought that we're dealing with this year. And so if we want to put it into perspective, what happens is that the greater the shortage and the more acres that are fallowed, the lower the ability to concentrate all those losses just in the lower priced field crops, and they start to have bigger impacts on the higher priced stuff, particularly when you've expanded your permanent plantings. And so this year there probably will really be some loss in those higher value permanent plantings. Employment loss compared to the previous year could be anywhere from 15 to 30,000 fewer jobs. I don't know at this point, again, extremely preliminary. And also the impacts are still most heavily felt in these 3 counties, but they're occurring statewide. So this time what's different than 2009 is I'm hearing from farmers in the Sacramento Valley about fallowing fields and laying off people. And I'm hearing from people in the tributaries in the northern San Joaquin Valley of being impacted by the drought. So it will have a broader geographic it's bad. Those are bad numbers. There's no doubt about it. It's serious. But from a state standpoint, and this is where I get a little upset when I see, Carl Guardino from Silicon Valley Leadership Group talk in these videos talk about a $2 trillion economy and how it's at risk by these water issues, is to put it in perspective, we're talking about 0.1 to maybe 0.2% of California GDP. So the drought is not going to tip California into a recession. Recent forecast from UCLA actually had lower impacts estimates than I'm making. So we're talking about, from the state of California itself, it's a fairly fractional impact. For agriculture, it's a less than 10% decline in California crop revenue. Now, 10% decline is serious. It's a big impact. But from a state, if we stand back and look at it, I mean, that's comparable to the kind of impact that the Midwest felt during the 2012 drought that was very serious in that region and has had impacts certainly on animal production and cattle and beef prices. But you do have to step back and see the issue, step back and take some perspective. And that, you have a drought like this. One of the things about difference between the way it hits in California and the Midwest, the crops are planted and then everything's, it's a rain agriculture there, right? And then it doesn't happen, and then you're right in the middle of it. And California is a bit of a slow motion disaster, right? You see it coming long ahead of time. And that means that, and it's bad, and that means that people ask politicians to do something. And there's a lot of pressure for action to do something, and you get into risk of making long-run policy mistakes if you enter into discussions like this sort of in the heat of concern about an issue and don't step back and take that perspective of what are the solutions. My argument, if you look at the data this year, will say we need to do something. Government should build more infrastructure. We need more dams. We need more storage. We need delta tunnels. If you look at the reports about those projects and the prospectus of them, they really wouldn't do much good in a year like this. They don't prevent you from drought. They don't make water. So there would be some benefit, but for the cost that they would entail, maybe not as much as you think. The same with relaxing environmental restrictions. And also, we need to consider that that shifts costs onto other communities as well as the environment. So it's important that we be able to manage the impacts, and we have to sort of make some discussion about what is a manageable level of drought impacts and how should we organize ourselves so that we can best cope with these water shortages, which are sort of an inevitable fact of life. So I cut out all the, I appreciate the video in part. I'm going to shift over to the BDCP because this is a shift over to long-run policy solutions, and I'm going to approach it from an economic perspective. And I cut out a few slides that sort of describe what the BDCP was, and I'm glad I did because of the video. And the one I left was the one they didn't talk about in the video, which is the cost. Which is, you know, there's a lot of wonderful things. And you watch the video, you might be deceived by the cost. Because when they talked about tunnels, they showed a picture of a cut and fill water infrastructure. I don't know if that's a drainage infrastructure or something. And, you know, those are expensive, and we've built those before. It has absolutely nothing in common with what they're talking about doing in the Delta, which is, you know, thought of as a really difficult project and a sort of a civil engineering wonder. It would be an exciting project to work on if you're an engineer. And if you do, it is. I mean, if you do environmental restoration, it's an exciting project too. People are talking about giving you billions of dollars to restore marsh, and so, you know, there's some people in the environmental community that are excited about that prospect. Although fewer and fewer of them are as they learn more and more about the plan. So this is the BDCP slide about the cost estimates. I'm not going to question their cost estimates at this point. They say they're at 10% level design, so there's a lot of uncertainty around the $25 billion cost estimate. That's all in 2012 dollars, so it's not counting inflation or anything of that. That's you know, last year's dollars, what they estimated would cost today. $16 billion for the tunnels, says $4.4 billion for habitat, another $2.6 billion for other habitat restorations. That would be these projects that sort of breach levees and restore marsh in the Delta, among other projects. Program oversight and other stressors. So that's a lot of money. I'm going to focus on the tunnels. There's actually, in the BDCP, there's actually some good stuff in the BDCP. The good stuff is not what the water agencies are paying for, though. That's what they're asking the people of California to pay for. And what I tell the people of California is that you don't need the tunnels to get the good stuff in the BDCP. There are some good environmental projects in it. They're not funded. The funding does not come from the water contractors for that project. A number of those projects are actually well advanced in the planning stage and will go forward anyway. And so one of the things we need to resist is, and one of the problems with the BDCP I consider to be sort of false packaging, that you can only get these things you like if they come with these tunnels. We need to talk about the tunnels. That's really the key question. Do they make sense? Do they make sense for the state of California? Do they make sense for agriculture? Well, the BDCP process, as they said in the video, started in 2006 with these water agencies coming together and with some environmental groups and trying to seek out a solution. You know, when I talk about, I can feel Barbara, I don't even look at her, grading at me saying that, because you say, well, the Delta, you know, where they're going to build all this stuff wasn't involved in the process, which is true. But I'm just going to talk about, does BDCP still make sense for water agencies, including water agencies that are here in the Valley, in Fresno, and Kern County, and other sorts of agencies. So that when the process started, it made sense to be involved in this process. Because what were they talking about? They said, well, we're going to build a new conveyance system around the Delta. Our cost estimate is that it'll cost about $4 billion. 7 years into the process, and that was for a surface canal. So due to cost overruns, new engineering, a switch to a tunnel plan, the cost estimates for conveyance costs and construction have increased by a factor of 4, $15 billion. Just on that fact alone, if you're running a water agency that has to pay for this thing, you've got to sit down with your sharp pencil and think about, do I still want to be in this plan? But it gets worse, because when they started the project, the water agency's expectations is that it would bring water exports up to their, up to a record level that they temporarily enjoyed before the courts intervened. And they anticipated water exports would be around 6.5 million acre feet. You can look at the metropolitan water districts and others. Now, basically, as the plans evolve, they've learned they can't get environmental permits for a project at that level. And now they're talking about water exports in a range from 4.7 to 5.6, or basically they're saying we're going to stabilize it at where things are today. So if you're a water agency, your costs have gone up 4 times, your water yield from the project has gone from being pretty significant to we're going to keep you where you are today. Again, it's not hard for an agency to, believe me, those in the valley that are involved in these discussions are well aware of these reasons, of these issues, and that's why some of them are thinking about backing out. What about the earthquake? Well, the estimates of seismic benefits of the tunnel to water supplies has declined significantly. They're not talking about 3-year outages being the norm anymore, but outages more likely in a matter of months, and that even the tunnels at the smaller size do not even offer 100% protection from the earthquake. They'd still see constrained exports in the event of this scenario. Not to mention all the debate about how likely it is and the alternatives to strengthen the levee system. Fourth reason why water agencies ought to be thinking twice about the tunnels is that when they started this in 2006, we had a very different economy and a very different growth trajectory for the state of California. Of course, a lot of people had recognized in 2006 that the state of California's growth was slowing significantly already. Water agencies still were tending to do their planning with projections from the 80s and 90s that had really rapid growth. But basically what we know is that the level of growth has declined, and actually point 4 here is a little bit different, but we know we're now in a period of severe fiscal stress for the state and federal governments. So the prospect that federal and state funding stepping in and funding a large part of this plan is much lower now than it was back then. And then the final point is this declining demand. Compared to when this process started, it's clear to everybody now that urban water demand is actually declining. Population forecasts are down in the state of California. The actual need to invest in water infrastructure for the future is lower. So I tell you to look at that list and say, would you want to stay into this if you're a water agency? Someone just flashed me a sign that said, I'm out of time, which is probably good because I got about 5 more slides, but they're more detailed, and I can probably just sort of end my remarks on this to say that there's some problems. So I will get out of the, you know what, I'm going to take can I take 2 minutes just to show a few things? Cost per acre foot of BDCP water. Now, the BDCP isn't talking about what the water yield is going to be, but they ranges from, and by water yield, I mean how much extra water can we ship south from the Delta if we build this thing compared to if we don't. And there's this huge range being discussed. And the most optimistic estimates put the cost of any incremental water supply well over $500 an acre feet. And all the financial planning is using these very, very optimistic estimates that are highly challenged, by the way. But farming doesn't work at $500 an acre feet. Even urban agencies are questioning the cost. This slide here I borrowed from the San Diego County Water Authority, which was testifying at a hearing to the California Assembly in February that I also testified at, and I listened to the San Diego Water Authority, which is the largest customer of Metropolitan Water District, and they're part of the planning process, and they're sort of on board with the BDCP, but they're very concerned about the cost. And they produced this slide that said, what about San Diego ratepayers? San Diego just made a very controversial decision to build the largest desalination plant in California, in Carlsbad. Total cost of that is about $1 billion a year. will generate 56,000 acre feet of purified, reliable water supply for them. And they've been criticized heavily for the extreme cost of that, which is over sort of $2,000 an acre foot. But they showed this slide to the General Assembly and said, how does this look, how does BDCP, paying for these tunnels, look to us for San Diego? Our share of the cost looks like $1 billion to $2 billion. Potential water supply benefit to San Diego is similar in quantity to their desal plant. Except for, instead of purified water that is received in drought years, they've got a highly variable supply. Well, they'll get a lot when it's wet, not so much when it's not wet. So they're concerned. First of all, it helps them deflect some of the flack about their desal plan, but they're saying, from a financial perspective, this is no small thing for our board, and it's comparable. And when we talk about a project where the majority of the water is actually going to irrigate crops and supposedly going to be paid for by farmers, we really need to be questioning the cost. Financing issues there's a lot of them that have to go forward that could sort of derail this project, from water bonds passing to they still don't have a cost allocation. But one of the most vexing issues to focus on today is that the water contractors have vowed to pay for this thing. The majority of that water is received by agriculture. How can San Joaquin Valley agriculture pay this cost? Their share of the debt service would be about $1 billion a year. So you look at this terrible drought year and the impacts we're feeling in the valley now. Under BDCP, we're not going to receive any more water in a drought year like today in the valley, but we will have to pay those bonds. And if they were paid for proportionally, as has been the discussion up to now, to be about $1 billion a year. It's completely untenable, and it's not going to happen. And so there's a real risk that the costs and the water supplies from BDCP could go towards those who could pay more, which means urban agencies. And so this is why I'm concerned. I believe BDCP I understand why the Metropolitan Water District is interested in BDCP. They're a financial behemoth, and their business is selling imported water. That's it. That's what they do. Colorado River and from the Delta. I understand why the State Department of Water Resources is interested in it. Most of their business is running the state water project. But I'm very concerned about the impacts of this project on San Joaquin Valley agriculture, which includes the Delta, where they're talking about removing up to 100,000 acres for habitat, not to mention the impacts from the water loss, and to state taxpayers paying up to $4 billion to do that. And also, what about the debt service or the South San Joaquin Valley for the agricultural industry down here? We haven't seen a financial plan, but we have seen documents and we have seen cost allocations, and discussions are there that promote more viable financing options. You can, if you actually get through, how many pages are in the BDCP EIR?
The plan and the EIR are a total of 40,000 pages.
So I haven't read most of it. I kind of skipped to the parts that are interesting. Every once in a while there's a couple of words about financing, and you will find even words in that EIR buried about financing, suggesting that financing could result in reallocation of water from agriculture to urban areas. And it do the math. They have to. So my concern for the valley is that financing options for the tunnels are bad for Delta agriculture, and they could be bad for San Joaquin Valley agriculture. They're not a viable solution. We could see actually less water in here. So the line I use is that the Delta tunnels could be the real man-made drought in the valley if the water has to go to the urban areas. Common sense alternative is for Barbara to talk about. Thank you for your time and the invitation to be here.
Anybody with questions, please write them on the card, and they will come back around this way. Dr. Michael, are you prepared to do?
I can answer questions all day.
Q&A. One of the things that I find interesting about the presentation we just heard is that a lot of the people are trying to stampede us, and most of them are ideologues. They are trying to stampede us into committing to do massive infrastructure projects. right now when there's a drought so that, you know, they can use it as an excuse to politically force us to do things for them. Essentially, what we live in is a feudal society here in the valley, and agriculture is pounding the drum for more and more water and more projects and things like that. But, as we just heard, there is really a big question about whether these things price out. And when you think about 24 to 26 billion dollars for a project like that, you know, and you realize that the people who are going to benefit from it the most may very well be huge landowners on the west side of the valley here. And the people who are being asked to pay for it, really, are the ratepayers for the Department of Water and Power down in Southern California, Los Angeles, San Diego, and Orange County, all those places now. Those people will have increased water bills, and that's where they're looking to get that money. They're looking to mine the pocketbooks of all of the people who live in Southern California. And as you heard just now, San Diego has begun to opt out because of the cost, you see. Who's next? And what if we get a big bunch of rain next year? What happens then? How do we deal with all that? Is it rational for us to do what is being proposed? That's a serious economic question, as you have just heard. Do we have some questions coming now?
Yes.
I know. Yeah, we'll take a couple of those questions and just.
Question here.
Dr. Mike? Oh, yes, come on. I'll try to read the questions. East Side farmers have trees dying. How about more storage of H2O, expansion of Shasta Dam? These are things that are going to be talked about in the next panel discussion that you're talking about. And by the way, East Side farmers don't get their water from that conveyance system that we were just talking about. East Side farmers get their water from the San Joaquin River here, the water that comes down to Millerton Lake. But 70% of that water is shipped down all the way to Kern County. If most of you didn't know that. And the East Side farmers have to share that water. So they get 25% depending upon how much is you know, maybe as much as 30%. And the rest of that water goes, why do they call it the Fryant-Kern Canal? It goes down to Kern County. So, go ahead.
Yeah, just on that topic of, you know, you can't paint agriculture in the San Joaquin Valley with a broad brush, and so I hate to use the term everywhere. It's very diverse across the valley. The majority of it is sustainable and will be here for a long time, and is important to the economy. And San Joaquin Valley agriculture includes the east side, the west side, the delta, and other areas. I mean, what about dams? I mean, and what can be done for I mean, it's true that when you have a drought, some of the things I talked about this year, the impacts are broader. So in 2009, there wasn't much impact on the east side, and this year we're seeing impacts on the east side, we're seeing impacts further north, and that's definitely occurring this year. The question is, you know, what about dams? And dams are extremely costly. Some of the things that are being discussed, and I recommend that people get out their ledger and look at the cost of those dams and the benefit that would result of them from water supply. People are going to talk about Temperance Flat later, you know, a dam that's, I guess the current cost estimates are down to $2.5 billion, but in the past has been over $3 billion for 76,000 acre feet of water yield. Who's going to pay for that? So so when I hear about those proposals in the valley, are you proposing a tax increase? Who is supposed to pay for your dam, because these are, you want the federal government to spend billions of dollars on this dam, and the question, is that a good return for taxpayers? What program would you like that you think is less valuable, that should receive less funding, and what taxes would you increase to pay for it? Financially, they don't pencil out that well.
Thank you very much. We are so far behind time that it's incredible. Well, we'll have to make that our last question, okay, because a lot of these questions anticipate what is coming up next, and I'd like to be able to get to that as much as I possibly can. And I'll try to have some of these questions for the other panel members too, because apparently they are directed at some of the other people. So our next presenters, okay, will be a panel of 3 specialists. The first is Lloyd Carter, former journalist, former U.S. attorney, now state water expert and activist. Lloyd will give us kind of a...
Excuse me, Barbara's going to be next. We've traded places. Barbara Bergen for
We've traded places?
yeah. Barbara, and then Lloyd, then Ken.
Yeah, well, I've got them all here. I'll just go, I'll introduce them in order, and then we can see who'll go first after that. So Lloyd Carter, he will give us his take on the growing pressure to build new dams, and Temperance Flat is, of course, one of those projects, okay? Next is Ken Schmidt. Ken Schmidt and Associates, a business consultant. Ken is a hydrologist and groundwater specialist. And Ken will talk about the problems and opportunities related to what likely will be a summer of heavy groundwater pumping, as I already mentioned. And thirdly, Barbara Barragan-Perea of Restore the Delta, a grassroots organization committed to making the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta fishable, drinkable, and farmable for the benefit of all. So please welcome all 3 of our panel members. Thank you very much.
This is, if you remember nothing else that I talk about today, I would suggest memorizing this cartoon. Because with climate change, and because we have a watershed that has been oversubscribed by 5 times in water rights granted by the State Water Resources Control Board, this is what we will end up with the tunnels. We experienced drought in California, or dry conditions, in the last 100 years, 40 years. The tunnels will not make more water, and this is what we're going to end up spending a lot of money on. I'm going to skip over the what you can do, except to tell you that my big ask today is for people to participate in the Bay Delta Conservation public comment process. We are in the public comment of the plan in the EIR. I'll be doing 2 workshops on that, and our deadline's coming up at June 13th. Okay. So you saw the video, and one of the things I want to strike in today and really drive home is that the messaging, the propaganda, even some of the things that people who are working on economics have to work with have come out in staged releases. And what those things say versus what is in the 40,000-page plan in EIR are very different. The story that's getting told does not match what is in the documents. I have read personally probably pushing on about 8,000 to 9,000 pages. I do most of my reading in the evenings. Our associate we work with, Jane Wagner-Tyke, has done probably about 10,000 pages, and we are collaborating with other groups that have read the other sections and changing information. So that's how we're able to talk about what's in the plan. Okay. Now, and going back to, well, hold on a second. I didn't want to go that far. Hold on. Want to take me back? Yeah. And just to explain really what that plan is, they're proposing to build 2 tunnels, 30 miles long, starting at the top of our map at Hood, California, which is just south of Sacramento. These tunnels are 40 feet high. They'll have 3 intakes to divert 9,000 cubic feet per second of the Sacramento River. If you look at our flows for the Sacramento River, you know, in July, they run at about 13,000, 14,000 cubic feet per second up at Hood. So you're looking at the capacity to divert 2/3 of the Sacramento River, our major freshwater source, because we lost so much water off of the San Joaquin River with upstream development. And they're going to put it in those tunnels and bypass the largest estuary on the west coast of the Americas, hook it back up down at the pumping plants down in Tracy, and ship the water outside of the area. One thing I really want to strongly emphasize as I go forward today about the conservation component about this, and that is that the plan and the EIRS have been scathingly criticized by the National Research Council, the National Academies, the Delta Independent Science Board, independent peer review panels, the red flag comments of the federal fishery agencies, review comments by the Corps of Engineers, the State Water Board, the US EPA, and environmental groups. And the reason why is habitat does not work without sufficient water flow. It does not create the food chain that you need to restore fisheries. And when you dig through the document, you learn that with operation of the tunnels, we are going to have greater decline in every fish species than if we did nothing. And I'm not advocating doing nothing. There was not one media story or press release, maybe they issued a press release, but not one media outlet has reported in a foreign language to the citizens of California or our 30 to 40% environmental justice community in the Delta that the plan was released or that they should be commenting and participating in the public comment period. In the interior of the Delta, from about Hood down to Rio Vista, which is a beautiful 7-generation-old farming community, 30% of our residents there, their children in school, are English as second language learners. Those families have been given no notice to participate in the process. And I think one of the things that just absolutely infuriates me is that every time we go through a drought, the drumbeat from Westlands and Kern County is that we have to have this water because our poor farm workers aren't being included in the economy of California. Don't get me wrong, I have great empathy and respect for all farm workers in the state, but it's our farm worker community that has been left out of the discussion. So what's wrong with the Bay Delta Conservation Plan? Only thing I'm going to add to what Dr. Jeff talked about is this bottom comment. Friends that we work with, through Public Freedom of Information Act requests, Westland's board meetings came up with the interest costs in today's dollars and operation costs. You're really looking at the project being closer to $67 billion. Mark Cohen, the director of DWR, confirmed that in fall of last year. One thing that Dr. Jeff talked about was the $4 billion contribution through general obligation bonds to pay for the Habitat Conservation Plan, but they are also seeking close to another $4 billion habitat investment from the federal government. So you'll pay for it through state taxes, federal taxes, and higher water rates. I'm going to skip over that for today. Failures of the BDCP include degraded water quality for the Delta. In fact, we have municipal water facilities in the Delta that will fail to meet Clean Water Act standards for the cities of Antioch. We will have salinity intrusion problems requiring millions, hundreds of millions of dollars of upgrades for water facilities for Contra Costa, Antioch, city of Stockton. The fish screens. The technology for the fish screens that they're proposing at the north intakes as of now does not exist. The project has only been 10% designed. It is all experimental technology. We were promised in the Delta 25 years ago under CalFed that the water takers would upgrade the fish screens. What they won't tell you in the propaganda is that 51% of the time they will still be pumping water from the South Delta. So this is no fix, because under dry conditions, they can't operate the new intakes at the north end of the delta. So if you're operating at the south end of the delta and you have no money set aside to fix the technology that we know is problematic and that we have an idea how to improve greatly, we're not going to improve our situation with the fisheries. One thing I do want to stop, going back to older data, is you have to look at and remember the delta agriculture economy is worth $5.2 billion. Recreation in the delta is worth another $750 million a year. And that estuary supports coastal fisheries that are estimated to run between $1 and $1.5 billion a year. Water quality affects the salmon fishery, the crab fishery, halibut up and down the coast because it's the nursery for halibut. And there have been no studies done that they have released that shows how the health of the delta impacts the health of the bay and is connected to how that estuary pushes out into the ocean. Bill Jennings from the California Sport Fishing Protection Alliance has done a wonderful analysis, species by species, to look at what happens to fish. He has about 15 slides. You can find it on our website under frequently asked questions. I took one of them. And what it shows is that with operation of the twin tunnels, as proposed, you're going to have a greater decline in salmon. This is just spring run. It's the same for all the runs, okay, than you would if you did nothing. These charts going into, again, countering some of the propaganda that's been, oh dear, why is this not showing up right? There we go, that's why. They like to talk about how the project has to be built because of sea level rise and because of earthquakes. I think it's really important to remember that even though portions of the delta are definitely below sea level, most of the statutory delta is not subsided. So what they've done is they've taken small concentrated problems on islands or in specific areas and have generalized it to state that the whole system is completely at risk and unsustainable. This map shows that sea level areas are vulnerable to sea level rise. The BDCP is not taking into account modeling by the U.S. Corps of Engineers, showing that even under conditions of maximum sea level rise, Suisun Bay and the South Yellow Bypass, not the Central Delta, are the areas that are going to subside. So with sea level rise, they're trying to say that the interior of the delta is going to collapse, and that's not the area, when you look at other science documents, that's really slated for that to happen. Let's see. Delta levees. This is one of my favorite ones to talk about. Does anyone notice anything in particular with the dates up there that they have listed on the BDCP for the levee failures? What? Yeah. Most of them, the last of the mass of the number is 1982. 1982 is in the deltas when we really started doing serious levee subvention work with the Bureau of Reclamation, Corps, the reclamation districts in the delta that pay for most of the levee improvements. What's really funny about their data is if you look at the end, that date, 1997, those levee breaks didn't even happen in the delta, but somehow it's made it onto proof that there's a problem in the delta on the BDCP. 2004 is a legitimate break. That was the Jones Track break, and most people believe that that was probably a beaver. If you have a levee system, if you have a levee system, you are going to have levee breaks anywhere in the world. But you can upgrade these levees to the highest possible seismic standards, according to Dr. Bob Pike, who is the geotechnical expert for the state on these issues, for $2 billion, $4 billion if you add in habitat on the water side. Also, about the earthquake threat, one thing you have to remember is the nearest major fault to the delta is the Hayward Fault, which is about 40 miles away. There are new faults that they've discovered under the delta. There's new faults that they've discovered everywhere in California. as work in the geotechnical fields becomes more specific. But as Dr. Pike explains, if you assess the risk of earthquake in the delta versus south of the delta, the risk for the water system being disrupted, there's a higher risk south of the delta, like where the canals pass over in Kalinga or south of the Tehachapi's. So what is being proposed to us is that we're going to spend upward of $60 billion to fix the first 30 miles of the water delivery system for earthquake threat. But we're not going to invest any money fixing it where the risk is actually higher. Doesn't make a lot of sense. As you can see, I'm skipping through things. Okay, declining species, I think I covered that for fish for you all. Let's see. I want to talk about regulatory uncertainty. I've talked about the problems that they're not going to be able to send water through in dry periods. Through a recent Freedom of Information Act, we have notes from the Kern County Water Agency talking about how they are going to operate the plan. These are their discussions for creating an implementing agreement for the BDCP, which has not yet been finalized. One of the things we found fascinating is in their discussions, they feel they're only going to operate the tunnels to save Delta smelt and longfin smelt. That means we will lose salmon. They will not operate it to protect any other species. So that's, to me, is part of the question of uncertainty. Okay, I have about 2 more issues because I'm being told I'm already out of time. I want to talk about the habitat issue. They want to remove, between the habitat program and construction of the tunnels, 140,000 acres of prime farmland out of production in the middle of the delta, you know, from top to bottom. The delta is the largest strip of prime farmland in California, with California's oldest family farms. They've been there for 6 and 7 generations. They reclaimed the islands in exchange for their land. It is being sold as the habitat has to happen because habitat doesn't exist. Except it does, and the potential for more and better habitat can be done without taking these farms out of production. This is not perfected yet, but one of the great water attorneys that we work with, and who's been at this for 60 years in his life, Dante Namalini, started drawing for us where habitat currently exists in the delta, public and private, public lands, private lands, where we have sunken islands that could be restored right now for habitat for fisheries, and where some of the channel work could be done for habitat. We already have 60,000 acres of public lands in California that serve as habitat, not all of it for fisheries, a good part of it for the Pacific Flyway. But if we were to go ahead and reclaim and restore some of the sunken islands in the delta and work with our public and private partnership, we could very easily have 80 to 100,000 acres of habitat without taking any farms out of production.
Barbara, thank you very much.
I know, I'm going to finish one thing.
Oh, okay.
Thank you. I just want to remind people that the majority of the water does go for big corporate agriculture on the west side of the San Joaquin Valley, but that's not the one thing I want to finish for you. I'm not even going to take, you know, I figure people here know about water technology. I have loads of pictures about how you use water efficiently. This is what I wanted to finish with for you. This is a visual comparison. Stina, who is here with me today, our campaign coordinator of Three Gorges Dam. At the top is the proposed project in a conceptual drawing by the Bureau of Reclamation. They're eeringly similar. And we know what kind of destruction went on with that with that project. And I think that's just something for people to think about and keep in the back of their minds. Thank you.
Thank you, Barbara. We're going to hold off on questions until all our presenters have had a chance to present their material.